The ER doors didn't open. They exploded. Paramedics burst through with a soldier hemorrhaging on the gurney, and right beside him, a blood-soaked Belgian Malinois who wouldn't let anyone get close. Staff scattered. Security reached for their radios. Someone screamed to call animal control. The dog wasn't barking. He wasn't lunging. He was planted over that man's chest like a living shield, watching every set of hands that came near. Everyone in that ER saw a threat. Stella Carter saw something else. She was 3 weeks into her first nursing job, considered the weakest person on the floor, and she was about to make the decision that would cost her everything she'd worked for. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, hit follow so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The shift had been quiet until it wasn't. Stella Carter was restocking saline bags in Bay 4 when the radio on the charge nurse's desk crackled to life, and the dispatcher's voice came through flat and urgent. Multiple trauma. Incoming. ETA. 90 seconds. She heard it, registered it, kept moving. 3 weeks in, she'd learned that quiet shifts ended without warning, and there was no point in tensing up before you had something concrete to work with. She was wrong to stay calm. The doors blew open with a sound like a pressure seal breaking, and the paramedics came through fast. 2 of them pushing a gurney, a third running alongside calling out stats, and behind all of it, a shape that made the entire ER stop moving. The dog was large, larger than Stella expected. A Belgian Malinois, probably 75 pounds, with a tactical vest still buckled across his chest, and blood matted so deep into his coat she couldn't tell where it was coming from. He moved in a tight orbit around the gurney, not chasing it, not dragging behind it, orbiting it, like a satellite that had locked onto something and refused to break pattern. His eyes swept the room in short, controlled arcs. Not frantic, not wild, calculating. The man on the gurney was worse. He was big, even unconscious, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes from years of deliberate work. Someone had field-dressed a wound on his upper left thigh, tourniquet applied, but the bandaging on his side told a second story. Blunt trauma, maybe shrapnel, the kind of injury that layers. His face was gray under the blood. The oxygen mask had fogged only slightly when the paramedic put it on, which meant he was breathing, but not strongly. GSW left thigh, suspected internal bleeding, BP 70 over palp, pulse ox 88 and dropping, the lead paramedic said as they pushed through into the main trauma bay. He was conscious for about 40 seconds in the field, said one word, just kept saying the dog's name. The dog heard that. His head came around and his gaze moved to the paramedic's face with an attention that made the hair on Stella's arms stand up. Dr. Kwame Ose was already moving. He was the attending tonight, a compact man in his late 40s with a reputation for being unshakable, and he was pulling on gloves as he walked toward the gurney. 2 other nurses fell in. The trauma bay organized itself the way it always did. People finding their positions, equipment coming off hooks and out of drawers. The dog moved. He didn't attack. He didn't lunge. He stepped forward and put himself between the gurney and Dr. Ose with a precision that was almost geometrical, and every person in the room who had been moving stopped moving. Jesus, someone said. Get animal control, someone else said. Security guard Marcus Webb was already on his radio, voice low, watching the dog the way you watch something that hasn't decided what it's going to do yet. 3 nurses had backed toward the wall. The paramedic who'd been managing the oxygen line had let go of it and taken 2 steps back. Stella had not moved. She was standing 8 feet from the dog, and she was watching him, and something she couldn't fully articulate yet was taking shape in the back of her mind. The dog wasn't attacking. He wasn't even threatening. He had placed himself as an obstacle, carefully, deliberately, between the injured man and the people he didn't know. That was different. That was a specific behavior that meant something. She'd grown up with working dogs. Her uncle had trained protection dogs for 15 years out of a facility in rural Idaho, and she'd spent every summer from age 6 to 16 in those kennels. She knew the difference between a dog that was afraid and a dog that was doing something it had been taught to do. This dog was not afraid. "Hey," Stella said, quietly. Not to anyone in the room, to the dog. His eyes came to her immediately. She didn't move toward him. She lowered herself slowly until she was crouching, which made her smaller, non-threatening, and also put her eyes below his line of sight for a moment. She looked slightly away. She held still. "What are you doing?" The voice came from behind her, sharp and female. Marissa Cole, head nurse, standing near the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that could have cut glass. Marissa had been head nurse at Riverside Crest Medical Center for 11 years, and she had made it clear in Stella's first week that the way things were done here was the way they would continue to be done, and that new hires who came in thinking they'd learned everything they needed to know in nursing school were her least favorite category of staff. "Giving him a second," Stella said, without turning around. "You need to step back from that animal." "I'm not near him." "You need to step back." The dog had not taken his eyes off Stella. She could feel it without looking at him. That specific quality of attention that working dogs have, intense and assessing, waiting to see what you do next. She moved her right hand slowly, palm out, low. Not commanding, just presenting, just existing. The dog's posture shifted. Not much, but enough. His weight moved fractionally back from his front legs. His tail dropped from the rigid horizontal it had been holding into something lower, looser. He was still watching her. He was still positioned between her and the gurney. But something in him had recalibrated. "His name is Titan," the paramedic said. His voice was careful. "That's what the soldier kept saying, Titan." Stella didn't use it yet. Too soon. She kept her hand where it was, kept her eyes slightly averted, kept her breathing even. The room was very still. "Titan." She said it like she was trying the word out, soft, not commanding, not pleading. The dog's ear moved. "You're doing good," she said. Not to be reassuring, because it was true. He had held a perimeter around a wounded man in an environment full of strangers and noise and things that smelled like antiseptic and blood that wasn't his, and he had not lost his composure. That was extraordinary, and on some level she thought he needed to hear it acknowledged. "You got him here. Good job." Titan took one step sideways. Not away from the gurney, but no longer directly between Stella and the patient. Dr. Osei, who had been watching this with his hands still in his gloves and remarkable self-control, moved immediately. A smooth, practiced step forward to the gurney's side, and the nurses closed in around him, and suddenly the trauma team was working again, and the dog was watching them work instead of blocking them. "Okay," Dr. Osei said. "Let's move." He didn't say anything else about the dog. He just started calling out orders. Stella stayed low for another moment, then slowly straightened. She could feel Marissa's eyes on her back like two hot points of pressure. Titan tracked her as she rose. He was alert, still watching the team work on the man, but his body was different now. He'd released something. When Stella took a quiet step toward the side of the bay, he moved with her. Not following her exactly, adjusting. She found a spot along the wall where she could observe and be out of the way, and the dog settled 2 feet from her, sitting rather than standing, facing the gurney. Stella kept her hands loose at her sides and watched Dr. Osei work. The soldier's vitals were bad, pulse ox still dropping. The tourniquet had slowed the bleeding from the thigh, but there was clearly something happening inside. The way Dr. Osei pressed his fingertips below the rib cage and then looked at the ultrasound monitor told Stella that much. She wasn't a trauma nurse yet. She was a general floor nurse 3 weeks out of orientation, but she'd paid attention in school, and she understood enough of what she was seeing to know that this man was in a genuinely dangerous place. "We need a surgical consult now," Dr. Osei said. "Get me Dr. Farzan on the phone." "Already paged," one of the nurses said. Stella watched the dog. Titan had not taken his eyes off the soldier. His chin was raised slightly. His breathing was steady. There was something in the way he sat there that wasn't grief exactly, too controlled for grief. But it wasn't detachment either. It was vigil. That was the word that came to Stella's mind. He was keeping vigil. She heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate ones. And then Victor Hale walked in. Victor Hale was the chief administrator of Riverside Crest Medical Center, and he had the particular quality of presence that certain administrators developed after too many years of managing up and downward simultaneously, a kind of calibrated authority that could expand or contract depending on who was in the room. He was in his mid-50s, with silver at his temples, and a suit that had probably cost more than Stella's first month's paycheck, and he walked through the trauma bay door with the air of someone arriving to correct a situation rather than understand one. He took in the scene in about 3 seconds. His eyes went to the dog. His expression did something controlled, but unmistakably negative. "Why is there still an animal in my ER?" Marissa materialized at his shoulder. "Animal control has been called. They're en route." "That's not acceptable. That animal needs to be removed now." He looked at Marcus Webb. "Can security not handle this?" Marcus, who was a 22-year-old security guard who had handled exactly no Belgian Malinois K9S in his career, looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Sir, I was advised not to approach an agitated animal without—" "He's not agitated," Stella said. The room went quiet in a different way than it had before. Victor turned to look at her. His gaze went to her badge, the new employee version with the green stripe that marked orientation status, and something in his face settled into a specific kind of dismissal. "Excuse me?" "He's not agitated," Stella said again. She tried to keep her voice level, informational, not combative. "He's a military working dog. He's performing trained protection behavior. He's not a threat to staff." "You're—" Victor glanced at her badge again. "You're a new floor nurse." "Yes." "And you're telling me how to manage a hospital safety situation." "I'm telling you what the dog is doing." She paused. "He's not the threat. He's the reason this man is alive." Something moved across Victor's face. Not consideration, more like offense, reorganized into authority. "Security," he said, still looking at Stella. "I want this animal removed. Use whatever means necessary." Dr. Osei stopped moving. "Victor," he said, and his voice had an edge that Stella hadn't heard from him before. "I have a patient on this table who is not going to survive long enough for a surgical consult if we spend the next 10 minutes escalating a situation that is currently under control." A silence. "The dog is calm," Dr. Osei continued. "My team is working. We will address the animal once the patient is stable. That is my medical call." He looked at Victor with a steadiness that didn't waver. "Are we good?" Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at the dog. He looked at the soldier on the gurney. He looked at the dog again. "Fine," he said. "But the moment this patient is moved to surgery, that animal gets secured. Are we clear?" He was looking at Stella when he said it. She held his gaze. "Yes, sir." He left. Marissa stayed. The next 30 minutes were the longest Stella could remember sitting still. She stayed near the wall. Titan stayed near her. She didn't try to touch him. She'd offered her hand twice, briefly, and both times he'd acknowledged it without making contact, which was fine. He didn't need to bond with her. He needed to know she wasn't a threat, and he'd established that. Dr. Osei worked efficiently, and to Stella's relief, well. The internal bleeding was confirmed, splenic involvement, they thought, and Dr. Farzan arrived from surgery in under 20 minutes, which was faster than expected. The team moved the soldier to an OR bay, and Titan tracked the gurney with his whole body, rising from sitting to standing, and for a moment Stella thought he was going to try to follow. She put her hand out, not touching him, just there, in his peripheral vision. He looked at her. "He's going to get help," she said. She felt slightly ridiculous saying it. She said it anyway. "He's going where people who know how to fix him are going. You got him this far." Titan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he sat down again. She let out a breath she'd been holding for probably 10 minutes. That was when animal control arrived. There were two of them, a man and a woman in gray uniforms, carrying equipment that included a catch pole and a sedation kit. They came in through the main entrance and were directed to the trauma bay by someone at the desk, and Stella saw them before they saw the dog, which gave her approximately 4 seconds to decide what she was going to do. She stepped forward. "Hold on," she said. The woman in front, her badge said Calloway, K, stopped and looked at her. "We have an order to remove and sedate an aggressive animal." "He's not aggressive." "Ma'am, we have a protocol." He's a military working dog. Stella kept her voice low. She was very aware that Marissa was somewhere behind her, and that whatever she said next was being noted and cataloged. He's in a high-stress environment, and he's been trained to protect an injured handler. Sedating him with a catch pole is going to escalate everything in this room, and we just got the situation stable. Can you give me 5 minutes? Calloway exchanged a look with her partner. We were told the dog was threatening staff. He wasn't. He was doing what he's trained to do. Stella took a breath. Please, 5 minutes. Stella, Marissa's voice, cold and final. Step aside. I'm asking for 5 minutes to... I said step aside. These officers have orders. Marissa walked forward until she was beside Stella, and the difference in their bearing in that moment was the difference between someone with 11 years of institutional authority and someone 3 weeks out of orientation. Remove the animal, Marissa said to the officers. Calloway moved forward. Her partner followed, catch pole extended. Titan came off the floor. He didn't lunge. He didn't snarl. He rose and he stepped forward, and he put his body directly between the officers and the corridor to the surgical suite, and the sound that came out of him was low and even and absolute. Not threatening in the way a panicking animal is threatening. Threatening in the way a warning is threatening. Deliberate and specific. The officers stopped. Stella moved without thinking. She stepped in front of Titan, not dramatically, not with any speech. She just moved there and stood, and the dog was directly behind her, and the catch pole was pointed at her sternum. What are you doing? Calloway said. He's not going to let you do that, Stella said. If you move that pole forward, you're going to force him to defend, and someone is going to get hurt. I don't think you want that, and I know I don't want that. She met the officer's eyes. Please lower the pole. A second passed, then 2. Carter. Victor Hale's voice from behind her, and it had completely changed register. No longer administrative tone, something colder, specific. Back away from that animal right now. She didn't turn around. If someone gets hurt because we force this dog into a corner, she said, that's on all of us. I'm asking for 5 minutes. That's all. Victor's footsteps came toward her, slow and deliberate. He stopped somewhere to her left, and she could see him in her peripheral vision without looking at him directly. His face had gone the kind of still that meant something had shifted past irritation into something more permanent. Lower the pole, Victor said to the officers. He waited until they did it. Then he turned to Stella. Give me your badge. The words landed like a door slamming. Sir, your badge. He held out his hand. You are currently employed on a probationary basis. You violated direct administrative orders on 2 separate occasions in the past hour. You've interfered with authorized personnel carrying out a safety protocol. His voice was even and precise and absolutely without heat, which somehow made it worse. Your employment at Riverside Crest Medical Center is terminated, effective immediately. Stella looked at him. She looked at Marissa, who was watching with an expression that was carefully neutral. She looked at Marcus Webb, who had the decency to look at the floor. She looked at the 2 animal control officers who were both staring at a point somewhere above everyone's heads. She unclipped her badge. She put it in Victor Hale's hand. Victor looked at Marcus. Escort her out. Marcus walked her out through the ER doors, past the nurse's station, past the waiting room where a woman with a crying toddler looked up as they passed, and out into the night air, which was cold and damp and smelled like rain. He stopped at the edge of the covered entrance. He couldn't go further without getting rained on. I'm sorry, he said quietly. He looked like he meant it. It's not your job to be sorry, she said. She wasn't angry at Marcus. She couldn't locate where her anger was yet. It was somewhere behind the numbness that had settled over her like a weight. She stood in the parking lot and the rain came down on her and she didn't move for a moment. Just stood there, in her scrubs, without a badge, listening to the rain hit the pavement and the distant sound of the city, and somewhere above her, the mechanical hum of the hospital she'd been escorted out of. 3 weeks. She'd lasted 3 weeks. She thought about Titan, still inside. She thought about the soldier in surgery. She didn't know his name. She didn't know anything about him except that he was badly hurt and that a dog had dragged or guided or simply refused to leave him, and that Titan's presence in that ER had told her something about the severity of what that man had been through. She started walking toward her car. She was halfway across the parking lot when she heard something behind her. Not from the hospital doors, from the east side of the lot, from the street. She turned automatically, the way you do when something doesn't sound right. There were vehicles on the street outside the hospital. She couldn't see them clearly in the rain and the dark, but she could see their shape. Large, dark, the kind of low profile that civilian SUVs didn't quite achieve. 3 of them. Maybe 4. Moving in a coordinated way she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't spent summers watching her uncle's facility, where personnel arrived in groups and moved with a specific kind of deliberateness. They weren't stopping at the patient drop-off. They were coming around to the main entrance. Stella stood in the rain and watched the vehicles pull in, and she counted the doors that opened, and she counted the people who got out, and none of them were in civilian clothes. She should have kept walking. She didn't. The vehicles stopped in a line along the curb, engines cutting off in a sequence that felt coordinated rather than coincidental, and the people who climbed out moved with the particular economy of motion that Stella associated with people who had trained that economy into their bodies over years. She counted 7 of them in the rain, maybe 8, dark tactical gear. No insignia she could read from this distance, but the way they moved told her more than insignia would have. They weren't rushing. Rushing was for people who were uncertain. These people moved like they'd already decided the outcome and were simply executing the steps to reach it. One of them, tall, built through the shoulders, moving slightly ahead of the others, stopped at the main entrance and said something to the person beside him. Then he looked out across the parking lot. Stella didn't know why she was certain he was looking at her specifically. The lot was dim, and the rain was coming down harder now, and she was standing between 2 parked cars. But he paused, and then he took 3 steps toward her direction, and she held still the way she'd held still with Titan, and he stopped. He turned back toward the entrance. She stood there another 10 seconds, rain soaking through her scrubs, and then she made a decision that she would later have difficulty explaining to herself. And she followed them inside. The lobby at 11:42 on a Tuesday night was not busy. A couple in the waiting area, a man with his arm in a makeshift sling, an elderly woman asleep in a chair with a magazine open on her lap. The night receptionist, Dara, looked up when Stella came through the doors, and her expression went through 3 things quickly: recognition, confusion, and then something careful. "Stella, I thought you—" "I know," Stella said quietly. "I'm not on the floor. I just need a minute." She moved to the side of the lobby, near the vending machines, where she could see the ER entrance without being the most obvious thing in the room. The tactical team had already gone through. She could see the tail end of them disappearing through the double doors. She should leave. She had no badge, no employment, no legal standing to be in this building in any professional capacity. If Victor saw her in here, he could have her removed again, and this time it would be a trespassing conversation rather than an employment one. She stayed anyway. She pulled out her phone and stood against the wall and tried to look like someone waiting for news about a family member, which was, in this hospital, the most common and invisible thing a person could be. Through the ER doors, she could hear the change in the air before she could hear specific words. The particular silence that falls when a room that was operating at one level of tension abruptly encounters a higher one. She'd experienced that silence twice tonight already. She recognized its texture. Then she heard Victor Hale's voice, raised in a way she hadn't heard it before. She pushed off the wall and moved toward the ER doors. "Tess, Commander Ethan Brooks had been running on 4 hours of sleep and 2 cups of bad coffee since the call came in, and he had arrived at Riverside Crest Medical Center in a state of controlled fury that he was not yet ready to release, because releasing it prematurely would not help Ryan and would not help Titan and would not accomplish anything except making him feel temporarily better. He did not enter the ER to feel temporarily better. He entered the ER because Ryan Mercer, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mercer, who had been with his unit for 9 years and who had survived things that would have broken most people, was somewhere in this building, and Titan was somewhere in this building, and Brooks had not been told either of those things by the hospital. He'd been told by the paramedic dispatch record, which he had accessed through channels that would have alarmed Riverside Crest's administration if they'd known. The ER was not what he expected. He'd expected chaos, A dog-related situation in a civilian hospital usually meant something visually dramatic. What he found instead was a trauma bay that had recently been the site of controlled activity and was now winding down from it, and a man in a good suit standing near the nurse's station with his arms crossed and his chin up, and another woman beside him, senior nursing staff, from the look of her, who was watching the doors with an expression that was either anger or anxiety, and possibly both. "I'm Commander Ethan Brooks," he said, because he didn't see the point of building to it. "United States Navy Special Operations. I'm looking for my man and my dog." The man in the suit, 50s, silver temples, the look of someone who managed buildings rather than people, took a half step forward. "This is a medical facility. We have protocols for—" "I'm not asking for a briefing on your protocols." Brooks kept his voice level. "I'm asking where my people are." The patient is currently in surgery." The administrator seemed to be recalibrating in real time, sorting through some internal decision tree about how much authority the man in front of him actually had. "As for the animal, his name is Titan. He's a United States military working dog and a classified operational asset, and whoever made the decision to sedate or remove him made that decision without understanding what they were authorizing." Brooks looked past the man toward the trauma bay. "Where is he?" The administrator, he still hadn't given his name, which Brooks noted, glanced at the woman beside him. Something passed between them. "The animal is currently in a secure holding area. We had a safety situation. I want to see him." "Sir, if you'd just— now." Brooks said it without raising his voice, and the word landed in the room the way a door closing in a quiet hallway lands. Not loud, but definite. He looked at his team. Petty Officer Delgado stepped forward, and the administrator seemed to register, for the first time, that there were 8 people behind Brooks, and none of them were here to negotiate. The woman in the nursing uniform cleared her throat. "I can take you to where the K-9 is being held." The man beside her gave her a sharp look. "He's entitled to his asset," she said, and her voice was tight in a way that suggested she was less comfortable with this situation than she was projecting. Brooks looked at her. "And the patient?" "He's in surgery. Dr. Farzan is his surgeon. The procedure started approximately 40 minutes ago, and we don't have an update yet. I want someone outside that OR." "I can arrange that." The man in the suit made a sound that was almost a word. The nursing supervisor walked past him without quite looking at him, and Brooks followed her, and his team spread out behind him in the way they'd learned to spread out over years of moving through spaces that weren't designed for them. As they passed through the main trauma area, Brooks's eye caught something on the floor near the east wall. Dark smear. He stopped. "That blood?" he said, to no one in particular. "Titans," one of his team said from beside him, Petty Officer Nguyen, who had been the primary handler on the last 2 rotations with Titan. Nguyen's face had gone tight in a way that Brooks recognized. Looks like secondary to the handler contact. Titan was with him when the vehicle went down. Brooks looked at the smear for a moment, then he moved on. The holding area turned out to be a supply closet that had been hastily rearranged, shelving pushed back, a folded-out pen from somewhere, a bowl of water that hadn't been touched. Titan was in the corner, not in the pen. Beside it, sitting against the wall, watching the door with the same focused attention that Brooks had seen on him in a dozen different environments over the past 3 years. When the door opened and Brooks stepped in, Titan stood. He crossed the small space in 2 strides and put his head against Brooks's leg, and Brooks put his hand on the dog's neck and held it there, and for a moment neither of them moved. Nguyen crouched down and ran his hands across Titan's coat methodically, checking for injury, for the blood source, for anything that needed immediate attention. "He's okay," Nguyen said after a moment. "This is mostly Ryan's. There's a cut on his left shoulder, not deep. He's going to be okay." Brooks straightened. He looked at the nursing supervisor, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed in a way that had shifted from defensive to something harder to read. "Tell me what happened when they came in," he said. She did. She was precise about it. He gave her that. She gave him timeline. She gave him the dog's behavior. She gave him the medical response. And then she told him about the nurse. Brooks listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "She stepped in front of the catch pole." "Yes." "To keep him from being sedated." "That's correct." "And then you fired her." A pause. "Administrator Hale terminated her employment." "Yes." Brooks looked at her for a long moment. "Where is she now?" Another pause, longer. "She was escorted from the building approximately—" "She's in the lobby." Everyone turned. The voice had come from outside the closet, slightly to the left, and when Brooks stepped back through the doorway, he saw the same nurse, young, scrubs soaked dark with rain, hair still wet, no badge, standing in the corridor with her arms at her sides and the expression of someone who had made a decision and was waiting to see what happened next. She was looking at Titan, who had come to the doorway behind Brooks, and was looking back at her. "You're the one who stayed with him," Brooks said. "Yes, sir." "After you were escorted out." She held his gaze. "I came back in. I don't have a good explanation for that." "What's your name?" "Stella Carter." He studied her for a moment. She didn't fidget. She didn't look at anything except him when he was talking to her, which was something that couldn't be taught. You either had the composure or you didn't. "Ryan Mercer is the soldier on that table," he said. "Chief Petty Officer, 9 years with my unit." He paused. "You didn't know that when you stepped in front of the pole." "No." "You did it anyway." "The dog wasn't the problem," she said. "He was never the problem." Brooks was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." Victor Hale was not a man who was easily unsettled, and he was working hard at maintaining that quality as he stood near the nurses' station and watched the door to the supply corridor and waited for Commander Brooks to come back out. He had made calls. While the military team was in the back with the dog, he had called the hospital's legal team, got the after-hours service, left a detailed message, and he had called the board liaison and left another message. And he had spoken briefly with Marissa about documentation, about the timeline, about making sure that everything that had been done tonight was defensible and written down in that order. He was not panicking. He was preparing. The distinction mattered. When Brooks came back through the corridor door with 3 of his team behind him, and behind them, Stella Carter. Stella Carter, who had been escorted out of this building 45 minutes ago, Victor's preparation met something it hadn't fully accounted for. "Why is she in this building?" Victor said. Brooks stopped. He looked at Victor with the expression of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last several minutes, exactly how he was going to handle this conversation. "You fired her," he said. "Tell me why." Victor kept his voice even. "She violated direct administrative orders on multiple occasions and interfered with the safety protocol. That's a termination-level offense under our employment agreement. She kept your animal control officers from sedating a military working dog with a catch pole in a trauma environment." Brooks' voice was still level. "You understand what that actually means?" "I understand that we had an uncontrolled animal in an ER and an unauthorized person obstructing the people who were there to remove it. Titan is not an uncontrolled animal. He is a trained military K-9 with active federal asset designation, which means the decision to sedate or remove him was not yours to make." Brooks took one step forward. He wasn't aggressive about it. He just moved the distance between them from social to something more deliberate. "You understand what federal asset designation means in a civilian context?" Victor opened his mouth. "It means," Brooks said, "that what happened in this ER tonight is going to require a report, a federal report filed with my command and with the relevant oversight bodies, documenting the actions taken regarding the asset and the personnel involved in those actions." He paused. "Including the personnel who ordered those actions." The room was very still. Marissa, standing slightly behind and to Victor's left, had stopped moving in a way that suggested she had become very conscious of where she was standing. "I'd like to know," Brooks said, "if the hospital board is aware of what happened tonight, the full account." Victor said, "The board will be briefed." "Tonight?" A beat. "In the morning." "I think," Brooks said, "it should be tonight." He looked at Stella. She was standing slightly behind his team, and she was watching Victor with an expression that was not triumphant, which told Brooks something about her that he filed carefully. People who'd been wronged and then vindicated usually couldn't keep the satisfaction off their face. She wasn't doing that. She was watching the situation with the same focused attention she'd used on Titan. "You'll want legal counsel before that call," Brooks said to Victor. "I'd suggest making it quickly." Victor looked at Stella. Then he looked at Brooks. His face had the particular quality of a man who understood for the first time that the ground he'd been standing on was not the ground he'd thought it was. He said nothing. Brooks turned to Petty Officer Nguyen. "Stay with Titan. Don't let anyone move him without my direct authorization." He looked at Stella. I want you to walk me through exactly what happened from the moment the paramedics came in." She nodded once. "Okay." They moved toward the consultation room off the main corridor, and Victor Hale watched them go, and Marissa leaned slightly toward him and said very quietly, "Victor, we need to talk." He didn't answer her. He was watching the door to the consultation room close behind Stella Carter, and somewhere in the processing happening behind his eyes, a number of things were being rapidly reassessed. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The caller ID read, "Hargrove, D. Board chair, Ashesh Keats." Victor stared at it for 2 full seconds before answering. "Hargrove," Victor said into the phone, and his voice had already changed. Tighter, more careful, the administrative confidence compressed into something smaller. Stella heard it as she was passing him on the way to the consultation room. She didn't slow down. The consultation room was small. A table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with someone's shift notes still on it from the day before. Brooks sat across from her, and one of his team, a compact woman with close-cropped hair who introduced herself only as Petty Officer Reyes, positioned herself near the door without being asked. Not blocking it, just there. Brooks put his forearms on the table. "Start from when the paramedics came in. Don't summarize. Walk me through it." So she did. So she told him about the ER doors, about Titan's positioning, about the way the dog had moved. Not chaotically, but with intent, establishing a perimeter rather than attacking. She told him about crouching down, about the hand, about the way Titan's weight had shifted when she used his name. She told him about Dr. Osei and the surgical consult and the 30 minutes against the wall. She told him about animal control arriving and what she'd seen in Calloway's equipment and why she knew the catch pole was going to trigger a defensive response that would end badly for everyone in that room. She told him about stepping in front of it. Brooks listened without interrupting. He had the quality of attention that she'd noticed on Titan. Still, focused, processing rather than waiting for a gap to talk. When she finished, he said, "You knew he wasn't going to hurt you." "I was pretty sure, not 100%. "That's honest." He looked at her. "Where'd you learn to read working dogs?" "My uncle trained protection dogs. I grew up around them." "Not nursing school, then?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Ryan Mercer has been on my team for 9 years. He and Titan have been partnered for 3. He said it plainly, without performance. The vehicle they were in went off the road on a mountain pass about 40 miles from here. Single occupant, Ryan and Titan. Ryan was unconscious when the vehicle stopped. The terrain made aerial extraction impossible for the first 2 hours. He paused. Titan stayed with him for those 2 hours. Kept him warm. Our team tracked the beacon to the vehicle and found Ryan still alive with Titan sitting on his chest. Stella said nothing. The injuries you saw were consistent with that. Ryan lost enough blood that another 30 to 40 minutes without surgical intervention would likely have been unsurvivable. He looked at her directly. The people in this hospital were going to sedate the dog that kept him alive, and they fired the person who stopped them. "I wasn't thinking about the math," Stella said. "I just knew he wasn't the problem." "I know." Brooks sat back slightly. "That's not a criticism." He looked toward the door, then back at her. "What do you want to happen next?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been braced for more questions, more documentation, possibly something involving her giving a formal account to someone with a clipboard. She hadn't expected to be asked what she wanted. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. "You were fired for doing the right thing." "I was fired for not following orders," she said, "from their perspective." Those aren't mutually exclusive. Brooks looked at her steadily. I'm going to tell you something. The board chair is currently on the phone with the man who fired you. By morning, a significant number of people in this hospital are going to know the full context of what happened tonight. What I'm asking is whether you want to be part of that conversation or whether you want to walk away from it. Stella thought about that. She thought about the drive home, wet scrubs, and no badge. She thought about the job listing she'd be looking at tomorrow and what she'd write in the box that asked why she'd left her previous position. I want to know if he's going to be okay, she said. Ryan Mercer, that's the first thing. Brooks' expression shifted fractionally. Not soft exactly, but something adjacent to it. We'll know more once he's out of surgery. Then I'll wait, she said. The OR board at Riverside Crest showed Ryan Mercer's case as active at 12:17 a.m., which meant Dr. Farzan was still in there, which meant the question of how badly things had gone in that vehicle had not yet been answered. Brooks had posted Petty Officer Delgado in the surgery waiting area with instructions to relay any update immediately. Reyes stayed with Stella. Nguyen stayed with Titan. That left Brooks with the problem of Victor Hale. The call with Hargrove had ended 11 minutes ago. Victor was now in his office on the second floor, and Marissa Cole had gone in with him 5 minutes after that, and the door had not opened since. Brooks knew the shape of what was happening behind that door. The same shape it always took when institutional authority encountered a situation it hadn't prepared for. Documenting backward. Constructing a version of events that fit inside existing policy language. Finding the paragraph that justified the decision that had already been made. He'd seen it in military context, too. It wasn't unique to hospitals. What was different about Victor Hale was that the decision he'd made had involved a federal military asset, which meant the documentation he was constructing was going to collide with a parallel account being filed by Brooks Command, an account that would reference asset designation numbers and federal working dog protection statutes, and the specific timeline of events, sourced from the paramedic dispatch records, the OR logs, and the account of Stella Carter, which Brooks had recorded with her permission on a device that now sat in his jacket pocket. By the time Victor's version was finished, it would have company. Brooks went upstairs. He didn't knock. That was intentional. Victor's office was a corner room with glass panels on two sides, which meant Brooks could see both Victor and Marissa before he opened the door, and they could see him, and the door handle moving was its own kind of announcement. Marissa looked up first. Her reaction was controlled, but not fast enough. There was a half second where her expression did something that told Brooks she was less settled than she was performing. Victor had his hands on the desk and a legal pad in front of him with writing on it. He looked up slowly, in the manner of a man who had decided to project that he was not surprised. "Commander," he said. Brooks sat down without being invited. "Tell me about your decision-making process tonight." Victor set his pen down. "I made a judgment call regarding the safety of my staff and my facility. The presence of an unrestrained animal in a trauma environment is a liability issue and a safety issue, and I acted accordingly." "Under what authority did you instruct animal control to sedate the dog?" "Under my authority as the chief administrator of this facility." "That authority extends to medical decisions regarding a federally designated military working dog?" Victor's jaw moved. "We had no way of confirming the animal's status at the time." "The dog was wearing a military tactical vest." A pause. "We had no documentation." "The paramedic who brought the patient in described the dog as a K9 unit. That's in the dispatch record." Brooks put his hand flat on the desk. "What you had was a staff member telling you what the dog was and why approaching it with a catchpole was dangerous, and you terminated her for saying it." "She violated—" "What specific policy did she violate?" Victor reached for the legal pad. He'd written something down there. Brooks could see it. Had probably been constructing the answer while he was on the phone with Hargrove. He found the line. Section 4.7 of the Staff Conduct Policy. Insubordination constituting direct refusal to comply with administrative directive. She didn't refuse. She asked for 5 minutes and explained her reasoning. She physically obstructed authorized personnel. She stood in front of a dog in a hospital corridor. She didn't assault anyone. Brooks looked at him. You know what the Federal Working Dog Protection Statute says about actions taken against military canines? I'll save you the lookup. It covers third-party interference with the operational capacity of a designated military working dog. Sedating Titan in a distressed state, in an unfamiliar environment with a catchpole, would have created recovery complications that could have compromised his operational future. He paused. That's the kind of thing that triggers an inquiry. Marissa said, "We weren't informed of the dog's status." "Stella Carter informed you," Brooks said. He looked at Marissa directly for the first time. "She told you he was a military working dog. You were present for that conversation. Your response was to tell animal control to proceed." Marissa's chin came up. "I don't have the authority to verify claims made by a probationary employee about an animal's military designation." "No," Brooks said, "but you had the authority to slow down. You chose not to." He stood. "I'd recommend that both of you speak to legal counsel before the board meeting tomorrow. Not tonight's after-hours service. Actual counsel, who's had time to review the federal statutes involved." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "The board chair asked me to be available for a call at 8 a.m. I'll tell them exactly what I've told you." He walked out without closing the door behind him. The surgery floor waiting room was beige and fluorescent and smelled like recycled air and vending machine coffee. And Stella had been sitting in it for 40 minutes when Dr. Farzan came out. He was still in his surgical cap, mask pulled down around his neck, and he moved with the deliberate tiredness of someone who had been concentrating hard for a long time and had now released it. He went to Delgado first. Delgado was the one in tactical gear, the most obviously military person in the room, and Delgado brought him to where Stella was sitting. Stella stood. "He's out," Dr. Farzan said. He had an accent she couldn't place and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at her with the directness of someone who didn't have the energy left for framing. "Splenic laceration, repaired. The femoral injury was less complex than we initially feared. The field tourniquet was correctly applied, which made a significant difference." He paused. "He's going to recovery now. He lost a significant amount of blood, but we replaced volume during the procedure. Barring complications, his prognosis is good." Stella sat back down. She hadn't realized her legs were prepared to give out until she was already in the chair. "The tourniquet," she said. "Yes. Someone applied it before he got here." Farzan nodded slowly. He seemed to understand what she was asking without her asking it fully. "Correctly positioned, correct tension. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." Stella thought about Titan, alone with an unconscious man for 2 hours in a vehicle on a mountain pass, and the entirely irrational thought she had next she kept to herself. Delgado was already on his radio. Mortet. Brooks got the update from Delgado at 12:51 a.m. and relayed it to his team in a 4-word message that wasn't emotional because it didn't need to be. They all understood what it meant. He stood in the second-floor corridor for a moment after sending it, hand against the wall, and allowed himself 30 seconds of something he didn't have a precise name for. Relief was part of it. The thing underneath relief. The part that came from 9 years of working next to someone and understanding exactly what it would mean if one specific call went the other way. Didn't have a cleaner label. He took the stairs back down. In the supply corridor, Nguyen had settled on the floor next to Titan, back against the wall, the dog's head in his lap. Titan was not asleep. His eyes were open, tracking the corridor, but there was something in his posture that had loosened since Brooks had been in there last. "He's out of surgery," Brooks said. "Stable." Nguyen looked up. He nodded once. He put his hand on Titan's head. Titan's tail moved, one slow sweep. The board chair arrived at 6:53 a.m. Dorothy Hargrove was 71 and had chaired the Riverside Crest Medical Center board for 8 years, and before that had spent 2 decades in hospital administration in 4 different states, and she arrived in the parking lot in a car she drove herself and walked through the main entrance without announcing herself, which was, Brooks would later think, the first reliable signal that she understood the situation clearly. She found Brooks in the family consultation room off the main lobby. Stella was there. Reyes was there. Hargrove came in, set her bag on the table, sat down, and said, "Tell me everything." So they did. Stella went first. Same account she'd given Brooks, same precision, same honesty about the moments where she hadn't been certain. Brooks followed with the federal asset context, the timeline, the recording. Hargrove listened with the specific quality of attention that told Brooks she was not building a response while they were talking. She was actually listening. When they finished, she said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Where's Victor now?" "His office," Brooks said. "He's been there since approximately 1 a.m. "And Marissa Cole?" "She left the building at 2:15. She came back at 6:30. Hargrove looked at that information without visible reaction. "The federal statute you cited, the working dog protection provisions, those carry civil liability?" "For the institution and for the individuals who gave the orders, yes." Hargrove's gaze moved to Stella. She studied her for a moment in a way that was direct without being unkind. "You were 3 weeks into your employment." "Yes, ma'am." "And you stepped in front of a catch pole for a dog you'd known for 30 minutes. Stella almost said it wasn't quite like that, and then decided it was actually exactly like that. "Yes." Hargrove looked at her a moment longer. Then she stood and picked up her bag. "I'm going to speak with Victor." She paused at the door. "Don't go anywhere." What happened in Victor Hale's office over the next 47 minutes, Stella didn't witness directly. She learned pieces of it later from different people and assembled them the way you assemble anything that happens behind a closed door, imperfectly, with gaps, the shape clearer than the detail. She knew that Hargrove went in alone. She knew that 2 members of the board arrived separately within the first 20 minutes. She saw them come through the lobby and get directed upstairs by Dara at the desk. She knew that the hospital's actual legal counsel, not the after-hours service, showed up at 7:40 with a briefcase and the expression of someone who had been given an incomplete picture on the phone and was now receiving a fuller one. She knew that Marissa Cole was called into a separate conference room at 7:55. She knew this because she saw Marissa walk past the consultation room doorway where Stella was sitting, and for a half-second their eyes met, and Marissa's face did something complicated, and then she looked away and kept walking. What Stella didn't know, couldn't have known yet, was what was being documented in those rooms, the specific forms the consequences would take. The difference between a conversation about what happened and a conversation about what happens next. She was thinking about that distinction when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost let it go, then picked up. "Ms. Carter," a woman's voice, precise, unhurried. "This is Sandra Yee from the Colorado State Nursing Board. We received a notification this morning regarding an incident at Riverside Crest Medical Center. I'd like to speak with you about your license status." Stella went very still. "My license status?" she said carefully. "We received a complaint filed at approximately 2 a.m. this morning. It's been flagged as priority review due to the nature of the allegations." A pause. "Are you available to come in today?" Stella looked at the wall. 2 a.m. Victor had been in his office since 1. The complaint had been filed an hour after Brooks had told him to get legal counsel. "What are the allegations?" she said. "I'm not able to give you specifics over the phone, but I want to be direct with you. A complaint of this nature, if it proceeds, could affect your nursing license." Another pause. "Ms. Carter, do you have legal representation?" She didn't. She was 26 years old with 3 weeks of nursing experience and no union rep and no lawyer and no badge, sitting in a consultation room of a hospital she'd been fired from, and someone had filed a complaint against her nursing license at 2 in the morning while she was sitting in the surgery waiting room not knowing any of this was happening. "I'll need to call you back," she said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she stood and walked down the corridor toward the main lobby, not because she had a plan, but because sitting still had stopped being an option. Brooks was near the nurse's station, speaking with Reyes in a low voice. He saw her face when she came around the corner and stopped talking. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She kept it short because the facts were short. Complaint filed, 2 a.m., license review, no representation. When she finished, he looked at Reyes and said, "Get Advocate on the phone." Reyes had her phone out before he finished the sentence. "What's Advocate?" Stella said. JAG adjacent legal team we work with for asset-related civilian incidents. They cover federal liability in cases involving military operations. He looked at her. They're going to want to talk to you. I'm not military. No. But what happened to you last night happened in the context of a military operation, and the complaint filed against you is a retaliatory action taken in response to your protecting a federal asset. He said it flatly, not building to anything. That puts it in our lane. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the chain of events, the gurney coming through the door, Titan's orbit, the catch pole, Victor's face when she'd put her badge in his hand, the nurse from Colorado State on the phone, Victor at his desk at 2 a.m. making a different kind of call. He filed it while I was in the waiting room, she said, while Ryan was in surgery. Yes. He knew I was still in the building. Yes. She wasn't angry yet. That surprised her. What she felt was something colder and more clarifying than anger. The specific feeling of understanding exactly what kind of person you were dealing with, and the specific feeling of understanding that you had not yet begun to deal with him. Okay, she said. I'll talk to your legal team. Reyes held out the phone. Stella took it. She was raising it to her ear when the sound came from the second floor. Not loud, not dramatic, but distinct in the particular quiet of an early morning hospital. A door. Footsteps. And then Victor Hale's voice carrying down the stairwell in a register she hadn't heard from him before, stripped of the administrative precision, something raw underneath it. You can't do this, he said. I have a contract, Hargrove's voice, level and final. Victor, stop talking. The footsteps on the stairwell continued, Victor's first, uneven in a way his footsteps had never been in the ER last night, and then Hargrove's behind them, measured and deliberate, and then a third set that Stella didn't recognize. She lowered the phone. Brooks put his hand out, palm down, slight. Not stopping her, just marking the moment. Wait. Victor came around the bottom of the stairs and into the lobby, and he looked different than he had at 2 a.m., different than he'd looked when he'd taken her badge from her hand. The suit was the same. The silver at his temples was the same. But something structural had shifted. The particular quality of authority that administrators carried in their own buildings, the thing that made a hallway feel like their hallway, was gone from him. And what was left underneath it was just a man in an expensive suit who hadn't slept and had run out of moves. He saw Stella. He stopped walking. Hargrove came around the bottom of the stairs behind him and kept moving, didn't stop, walked past Victor as though he were furniture, and came to where Brooks and Stella were standing. Ms. Carter, she said, the board has voted to revoke Administrator Hale's authority pending a formal investigation. He will be escorted from the building within the hour. She said it without drama, without satisfaction, just information delivered cleanly. I want to be direct with you about the complaint filed with the nursing board. We are aware of it. The hospital's legal team is in contact with the board this morning to provide context, and we will be submitting a formal statement on your behalf, making clear that the complaint was filed in retaliation and does not reflect the hospital's assessment of your conduct. She paused. That statement will include the board's position that your actions last night were appropriate, professional, and consistent with the highest standards of patient and asset care. Stella heard it. She processed it. She said, "What about Marissa Cole?" Hargrove's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Ms. Cole's situation is being addressed separately, which meant it was being addressed. Stella noted the distinction and held it. I'd also like to know, Stella said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was, whether Ryan Mercer has been informed of what happened. Commander Brooks has been in contact with the patient's medical team, Hargrove said. He's out of recovery and conscious. Stella looked at Brooks. He's asking about Titan, Brooks said. There was something in the way he said it that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Pocham. Victor did not leave quietly. This was not surprising. Stella had the sense that men like Victor rarely did, that the performance of authority they'd built over years of institutional life didn't simply stop when the institution stopped backing them. It compressed, briefly, into something less dignified before it went out. She wasn't in the lobby when security came for him. She heard about it afterward from Dara, who had been at the reception desk and had watched the whole thing with the specific attention of someone who had worked a front desk for 6 years and understood that moments like this were archived in detail by everyone present. Victor had argued with Marcus Webb. He had cited his contract. He had said the word lawsuit 3 times in 4 minutes. He had demanded to speak with the board's legal counsel directly and been told that legal counsel was currently engaged. He had said Dorothy Hargrove's name in a tone that Dara described as a man who has confused knowing someone's name with having leverage over them, which was the most precise thing anyone said about Victor Hale that day. Marcus, 22 years old, the same Marcus who'd walked Stella out in the rain the night before, had held the lobby door open and said, with a politeness that must have required genuine effort, "Sir, I've been asked to see you out." Victor had left. His keycard was deactivated at 8:47 a.m. Stella learned about the keycard from an email. She was sitting in the family consultation room with the Advocate legal team. 2 of them, both sharp and fast, who had arrived in person rather than staying on the phone, which told her something about how seriously Brooks's unit took this. And her personal phone was on the table face up, and the notification came through from the hospital HR system because she was still in their database, still technically an employee whose termination was now under review. And the system sent automated notifications to employees about facility access changes for their department, and her department was the ER, and the ER was Victor's domain, and the system flagged it. She looked at it. She turned it face down. The legal team's names were Priya Okafor and James Sutton. Okafor was doing most of the talking. She was probably 35, with reading glasses and a legal pad, and the manner of someone who had sat across from nursing board investigators before and understood exactly where the pressure points were. The complaint, Okafor said, was filed at 2:14 a.m., which means it was filed less than 90 minutes after Commander Brooks advised Administrator Hale to seek counsel. That timeline is going to be very difficult for the complainant to explain as anything other than retaliatory. She tapped her pen on the pad. The nursing board has a specific protocol for complaints that arrive with this kind of flag. Filed overnight, priority designation requested. Filed by an institutional administrator against a staff member who was terminated hours earlier. It doesn't automatically dismiss them. But it does trigger a secondary review of the filer's conduct and motivation. Meaning they look at Victor, Stella said. Meaning they look at the circumstances under which the complaint was generated. Okafor looked at her. What we're going to do is submit your account, the dispatch records, the commander's statement, and the hospital board statement as a response packet. We'll also submit the federal asset designation records for Titan, which establish that your actions were protective of a military working dog under active duty status. She paused. Has the nursing board investigator spoken to you directly yet? She called. I haven't called back. Don't until we've drafted your formal response. Okafor's pen moved. I want you to understand something. The complaint is filed, and I've seen the initial text now. James pulled it this morning. Describes your conduct as reckless endangerment of hospital staff and obstruction of a safety protocol. It does not mention the military status of the K-9. It does not mention that you were the person who stabilized the situation in the first place. She looked up from the pad. It is not an accurate account. Stella sat with that for a moment. She had known it wasn't accurate. Hearing it stated plainly by someone whose job was to assess these things precisely was different. What happens to the complaint? She said. If we submit what I've described and the board does its job, it gets dismissed. Okafor's voice was matter of fact. There's also the question of whether you want to file a counter-complaint against the administrator for retaliatory filing. That's a separate decision and not one you need to make today. Sutton, who had been quiet, said, There's also the question of your employment status, the termination itself. The board is reviewing it, Stella said. Yes, and the board can reinstate you. What they can't do is give you back the hours you spent out in the rain without a badge or the damage to your professional record that comes from a termination notation, even if it's later expunged. Sutton was precise about this in a way that felt like preparation rather than alarm. If you want to pursue the wrongful termination separately, you have a case. Stella looked at him. I want my job back first. That's the right priority. He made a note. We'll work in that order. Deet, At 9:15, Stella walked down to the supply corridor. Nguyen was still there, on the floor, asleep now, his head tipped back against the wall, Titan's head across his knee, both of them finally out. She stopped in the doorway and didn't go in. The dog's ear moved. He opened one eye, looked at her, and closed it again. She stood there for a minute. Then she went back to the family consultation room and sat down and drank the worst coffee she'd ever had from the machine in the hall and stared at the whiteboard with yesterday's shift notes on it. And she thought about Ryan Mercer conscious upstairs, asking about his dog. She thought about the 2 hours on that mountain pass, the temperature in the Rockies overnight, the terrain Delgado had described when he'd given her the briefing context. Steep grade, no cell signal, the vehicle off the road in a position that made aerial extraction impossible for the first response window. 2 hours was a long time to be unconscious on a mountain in the cold with a bleeding leg. She thought about what Farzan had said. The tourniquet had been correctly applied, correct position, correct tension. Someone had done that before the paramedics arrived. She thought about Titan's vest, still buckled when he'd come through the ER doors. She thought about a lot of things she had no way of verifying and set them aside, because her job was not to make meaning out of things she didn't know. Her job right now was to sit in this room and wait for the legal team to finish their calls, and for the board to finish their process, and for the morning to resolve into whatever it was going to be. She was not good at waiting. She was doing it anyway. At 10:03, Dorothy Hargrove came back. She had 2 board members with her this time. Stella had seen them arrive earlier but didn't know their names. Hargrove introduced them as Martin Reeves and Dr. Agatha Nweek. Reeves was finance. Nweek was a physician who sat on the credentialing committee. They sat down at the table and the legal team moved their papers to make room, and Hargrove put her hands flat on the table in a way that indicated this conversation was going to be precise. "We've completed our preliminary review," Hargrove said. "I want to tell you what we found and what we've decided, and then I want to hear from you." Stella nodded. "Administrator Hale made the decision to terminate your employment without consulting HR, without the standard 30-day probationary warning process, and without the documentation required for immediate termination under our employment policy." Hargrove said this evenly. "The grounds he cited, insubordination and obstruction, do not meet the threshold for immediate termination under our own standards, which require either willful patient harm or criminal conduct. Stepping in front of an animal control officer is not criminal conduct." She paused. "The termination was improper on procedural grounds alone, independent of the substantive question of whether your conduct was appropriate, which, for the record, the board's position is that it was." Dr. Nowicki said, "The credentialing committee reviewed your nursing school record and your clinical evaluations from your 3 weeks here. You were in the top quartile of your orientation cohort. You had no negative flags from your preceptor." She said it not as reassurance but as fact, establishing the record. "The complaint filed with the nursing board is inconsistent with every documented assessment of your clinical performance." Reeves said, "The financial and reputational exposure to this hospital from the federal asset situation is significant. I want to be transparent with you. Our legal team is working this morning partly because of that. I don't want you to think this is purely about justice." He said it flatly, which Stella respected. "But the outcome is the same, regardless of the motivation. You're being reinstated." "With what position?" Stella said. A brief pause. Hargrove and Nowicki exchanged a look. "That's the second part of what we want to discuss," Hargrove said. The second part took 30 minutes, and at the end of it, Stella walked out of the family consultation room with a piece of paper, not her badge yet, that would come later, from HR, but a signed letter from the board chair confirming her reinstatement to Riverside Crest Medical Center, effective immediately, with a designation change from general floor nursing to the trauma nursing rotation, contingent on a 6-week supervised transition that was standard for the unit regardless of how someone came to it. It was not a perfect outcome. The supervised transition meant she'd be watched closely for 6 weeks by people who would know about last night. The trauma unit had its own culture, its own hierarchy, and she was coming in through a side door that wasn't the normal door, which meant she'd have to prove herself in a context that had a full account of who she was before she'd had a single shift. She was aware of all of this. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went to find Brooks. He was in the main ER, near the ambulance bay doors, on his phone. When he saw her, he ended the call. She showed him the letter. He read it in 10 seconds and handed it back. Trauma unit, he said. Supervised transition. That's standard there. He looked at her. It's a good unit. I know. She put the letter back in her pocket. What's happening with the nursing board complaint? Okafor filed the response packet 40 minutes ago. She's confident it'll be flagged for dismissal. He paused. Victor's complaint is the weakest part of his position legally. The federal asset angle is the part that's going to follow him. He said this without relish. The inquiry my command files will reference what happened here. His name will be in that report. What does that mean for him practically? Brooks considered the question the way he considered most things, without rush. It means that anyone conducting due diligence on Victor Hale in the future, another hospital, a board, a licensing body, will find a federal incident inquiry with his name attached. It doesn't convict him of anything. But it exists. He paused again. There's also the question of Marissa Cole. Hargrove said her situation was being addressed separately. It is. I spoke to Hargrove directly this morning about Cole's specific role. She was the senior nursing authority present when the animal control order was given. Her name is also in my report. He looked at her. She gave the order after you'd already explained what the dog was. That's documented. The paramedic confirmed it in his statement to my team. Stella thought about Marissa, the crossed arms, the specific quality of dismissal in her voice in the trauma bay, the way she'd moved toward the animal control officers. 11 years in this hospital, 11 years of knowing exactly how things were done here and making sure everyone else knew it too. Is she still in the building? Stella asked. She's in a meeting with the credentialing committee right now. Stella absorbed that. Dr. Nweki, credentialing committee. The meeting that had been happening while she was in the consultation room. How long has she been in there? Since 9:45. It was now 10:51. An hour and 6 minutes in a credentialing committee meeting was not a short meeting. A short meeting was 20 minutes and a letter of concern. An hour and 6 minutes was something that would result in a document with more weight to it. Okay, Stella said. Okay, Brooks said. They stood in the ambulance bay for a moment, in the particular quiet that follows a long night when the morning has finally arrived and the damage is tallied. Can I see him? Stella said. Ryan, if he's conscious, and if that's appropriate. Brooks looked at her for a moment. Come on. Room 412 was a standard recovery room. Adjustable bed, monitor cluster, IV line, the particular institutional light that was never quite day and never quite night. Ryan Mercer was in it, elevated to about 45 degrees, with the color of someone who had lost significant blood and gotten most of it back in a bag, pale in the wrong places, bruised under both eyes from the impact, a dressing on his left side, and another on his thigh visible under the blanket edge. He was awake, clearly awake, eyes tracking, jaw set in the way of someone in managed pain. He looked at Brooks when they came in, and then at Stella, and she could see him registering her scrubs, the absence of a badge, the fact that she was here at all. This her? He said to Brooks. His voice was rough and low, the way voices got when a breathing tube had recently been removed. This is Stella Carter, Brooks said. She's the one who kept Titan from being sedated. Ryan looked at her with the attention of someone who was conserving energy and directing what they had. Titan's okay? He's downstairs, Brooks said. With Nguyen. He's fine. Ryan closed his eyes for a second, opened them. I remember the dog barking, he said. His voice was careful, like he was working through fog. When we went off the road, I remember Titan barking, and then I don't remember much after that until the paramedics. He paused. They said a nurse stood between him and animal control. That was me, Stella said. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Not the pat answer, not the version that sounded good. The actual reason. Because I could see what he was doing, she said. He wasn't out of control. He was protecting you, and they were going to punish him for it, and that wasn't right. She paused. That's the whole reason. Ryan was quiet. His monitor beeped steadily. Outside the room, a cart went by in the hallway. They really fired you for that, he said. They did. And you came back anyway. I didn't plan to, she said. I just didn't leave. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile. Couldn't be. Not with the pain he was managing, but it was something. Sounds right, he said. Muwok. She found out about Marissa at 11:34 from Dara, who texted her with the particular energy of someone who'd been waiting to have something to report. Cole came out of committee at 11:28. She went straight to her office and didn't come back out. Security told me her access card request was flagged. Same system flag as Victor's this morning. Stella read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket. She was in the staff break room off the second-floor corridor, where someone had left a half-eaten box of crackers on the table, and the coffee machine had been beeping a cycle warning for what sounded like several hours. She'd gone there because she needed somewhere to sit that wasn't a consultation room or a waiting area or a place where she was in the middle of something. She'd been in the middle of something for 15 hours. She ate 3 crackers. She fixed the coffee machine's cycle warning by hitting the reset button, which took 4 seconds and which clearly no one had done in a while. She sat down and looked at the wall and let herself be tired for a few minutes, which was different from the exhaustion she'd been running on. This was intentional, chosen, a brief allowance before the next thing. The next thing came at 11:49. Her phone again. Not Dara. A number she didn't recognize, Denver area code. She picked up. Miss Carter? A man's voice, older, formal, without being stiff. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm the director of the Colorado State Nursing Board. I'm calling directly because of some information that's come to our office this morning that bears on a complaint filed last night. Stella sat up straighter. I want to be transparent with you, Whitmore said. The complaint you received notification of this morning has been reviewed by our preliminary board. We've also received the response packet from your legal representatives and a formal statement from the Riverside Crest Medical Center board. He paused. Additionally, we received a statement this morning from Commander Ethan Brooks of Naval Special Operations, which included a copy of the federal K-9 asset designation for the animal in question and a statement about the circumstances of the incident. Okay, Stella said. The preliminary board has voted to dismiss the complaint. He said it without preamble. The grounds for dismissal are as follows. The complaint was filed without adequate evidentiary basis. The conduct described does not meet the threshold for nursing board review under state statute, and there is documented evidence that the complaint was filed in a retaliatory context. A brief pause. You will receive written confirmation within 48 hours. Your license is in good standing, and there will be no notation on your professional record from this complaint. Stella pressed her fingers to her eyes. Just for a second. Thank you, she said. One more thing, Whitmore said. The board is opening a review of the conduct of the individual who filed the complaint. Administrator Hale. That review is independent of any action the hospital takes. If you receive any further contact from him regarding your nursing license or professional status, you should contact our office directly. He gave her a number. Good luck, Ms. Carter. He ended the call. She sat in the break room with the phone in her lap and the coffee machine doing its slow cycle and the crackers on the table, and she let the whole night stack up for a moment. The gurney, the dog, the rain, the parking lot, Victor's hand extended for her badge, the surgery waiting room, the advocate legal team, the consultation room. Ryan Mercer's voice saying, sounds right from a hospital bed. And she held it there for maybe 30 seconds. Then she stood up. She was in the corridor outside the break room, heading back toward the main floor, when she heard voices from the stairwell above, not raised but carrying the sound of a conversation that had moved past argument into something more final. She recognized Marissa Cole's voice first. I've been here 11 years. There was something in Marissa's voice that Stella had not heard before. Not anger, closer to disbelief. The specific quality of someone who had built their understanding of how the world worked on a particular foundation and was standing in the rubble of it. The other voice was Dr. Nwaiki's. I understand that. The committee's decision isn't about your tenure. I followed the administrator's directive. You were the senior nursing authority present, Nwaiki said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. The committee's finding is that a senior nurse who had been informed of the animal's military status and who had the authority to pause the procedure pending verification chose not to exercise that authority. That finding stands independent of what Victor Hale told you to do. A silence. What happens to my license? Marissa said. Stella stopped walking. The committee is submitting a formal finding to the state nursing board, Nweck said. The finding will recommend a review of your licensure. The board makes its own determination. A pause. I'd recommend you speak to legal counsel today. Stella heard footsteps. Nweke descending, coming toward the floor Stella was on. She moved back into the break room doorway. Nweke came around the stairwell and walked past without seeing her, brisk and purposeful, heels on the linoleum, a folder under her arm. From above, in the stairwell, Stella heard nothing for a long moment. Then she heard the sound of a door closing, and then she heard nothing at all. She stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the way institutions shaped people, or the way people let institutions shape them, and how hard it was sometimes to locate the line between following a directive and making a choice. She thought about Marissa's face in the trauma bay. Not cruel, exactly. Not sadistic, just certain. Certain in the way that people were certain when they'd been doing something one way for long enough that alternatives stopped feeling real. She wasn't sorry for what was happening to Marissa. She didn't feel good about it either. It was just what happened when a set of decisions met their consequences, and the consequences had weight. She walked back to the main floor. Brooks was waiting near the nurse's station with an expression that was neutral in a way she'd learned to read as him having information he was organizing before speaking. Whitmore called me, she said. I know. He called me right before he called you. Brooks looked at her. There's one more thing. She waited. My command has formally requested that the hospital create a protocol for military working dogs brought in through emergency services. He said it evenly. Standard identification, standard handling, a designated staff contact who can serve as the liaison. Hargrove agreed this morning. He paused. They want to know if you'd be willing to serve in that liaison role, in addition to your trauma nursing duties. It would require a 4-hour certification course through our K-9 unit. Unpaid for the certification, but the liaison designation comes with a formal commendation in your professional record from Naval Special Operations. Stella looked at him. That's a commendation from your unit. Yes. For a 4-hour course. For last night, he said. The course is just the paperwork. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the phone call from Whitmore, the crackers on the break room table, the sound of Marissa's voice asking what happens to my license in a stairwell. She thought about Titan's ear moving when she'd appeared in the doorway. Yes, she said. Brooks nodded once. There's a staff meeting at 1 p.m., he said. Hargrove is addressing the department. She asked me to attend. He looked at her. She asked if you'd attend as well. Stella looked down the corridor toward the main ER. The nurse's station, the bay curtains, the board with patient status updates, the world she'd been walked out of in the rain 15 hours ago. What time is it now? She said. 12:11. She had 49 minutes. I need a clean pair of scrubs, she said. Brooks looked at her for a moment. Then he said, There's a supply room on the 3rd floor. Marcus Webb knows where the code is. She started walking. She was 3 steps down the corridor when she heard the elevator behind her open, and a sound she wasn't expecting. A sound that did not belong on a hospital floor, and that several nearby staff members turned toward simultaneously. The specific sound of a dog's nails on linoleum, and then Nguyen's voice, Hey! Hey, Titan! She turned. Titan was coming down the corridor at a dead run, tactical vest still on, lead trailing behind him where Nguyen had apparently lost his grip, and he covered the distance between them in about 4 seconds and hit her at knee level and sat directly on her feet and looked up at her with the expression she had last seen in the supply closet doorway, watchful, specific, utterly certain of exactly where he was supposed to be. Nguyen came around the corner at a jog, slightly out of breath, lead in his hand. I'm sorry. He saw you from the elevator and I couldn't. He stopped. He looked at Titan sitting on her feet. He pressed his lips together. Stella looked down at the dog. Titan looked up at her. She put her hand on his head, and she felt him lean into it, and she stood there in the middle of the corridor of the hospital that had fired her in the rain, and she thought, very clearly, this is the part they didn't account for. She would remember that thought later when she was in the staff meeting and Hargrove was speaking to a room full of people who had watched last night happen and were watching what came next. She would remember it, and it would still be true, and it would be enough. But she didn't know yet that the staff meeting wasn't just a department address. She didn't know that Hargrove had asked someone else to attend. She didn't know who was going to walk through that conference room door at 1:02 p.m., 6 minutes late, moving slowly with a cane on his left side and a large dog pressed against his right leg. And she didn't know what it was going to mean when he looked across the room and found her face the way Titan had found her in the corridor. She didn't know any of that yet. She crouched down and let Titan investigate her hands, and she stood back up, and she went to find Marcus Webb and a clean pair of scrubs. Marcus Webb found her a pair of scrubs in her size without asking why, which was its own kind of kindness. He punched in the supply room code, held the door, and when she came back out, he said, "For what it's worth, I've been thinking about last night since it happened." And she said, "You did your job." And he said, "That's not, yeah, okay." And she could see him deciding whether to say more and deciding not to, and she appreciated both the impulse and the restraint. She changed in the third-floor bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. No badge yet. That would come from HR after the 1 p.m. meeting, Hargrove had said. Clean scrubs, no badge, hair pulled back, the face of someone who had been awake for 20 hours and was running on crackers and bad coffee and something harder to name. She looked fine. She looked like a nurse. That was enough. She took the stairs down. The conference room was on the second floor, past the administrative corridor, a long rectangular room with a table that seated 20 and chairs along the walls for overflow. By 12:55, it was fuller than Stella expected. Not just ER staff, but surgical nurses, 2 attending physicians she didn't recognize, residents, the day shift charge nurse, people who had heard about last night through the particular speed that hospital information traveled, which was faster than any formal communication system the administration had ever built. Dr. Osei was there. He caught her eye when she came in and gave her a single nod, which from him felt like a speech. Dr. Farzan was in the back, still in his surgical cap, clearly between cases. He didn't look at her, but she recognized the posture of someone who had decided to be present at a specific thing. Brooks was near the front, standing rather than sitting, with Reyes beside him. Nguyen had Titan in the corridor outside. Titan could not attend a staff meeting, which was a logistical reality rather than a commentary on his contributions. Brooks had told her that with a straightness that she suspected was not entirely unintentional. Stella found a chair along the wall, not at the table. She was not yet a member of this department in any formal sense. She sat at the edge of it, which felt accurate. Hargrove came in at 1 p.m. exactly and stood at the head of the table without using the chair. She didn't have notes. She looked around the room the way people looked around rooms when they were about to say something they'd decided on and weren't going to soften. "I want to talk about what happened last night," she said. "Not the version that gets summarized in a board statement, but what actually happened. I think everyone in this room deserves to hear it plainly." The room was quiet in the way rooms were quiet when people who'd been talking about something were now being given permission to hear it officially. She told it plainly. She told it starting from the paramedics coming through the doors, moving through the dog, through Stella's intervention, through Victor's decision to terminate, through Stella standing in the parking lot in the rain. She told it through the military team arriving, through the surgical outcome for Ryan Mercer, through the 2 a.m. complaint filed against a nurse who was in the surgery waiting room when it was filed. She didn't editorialize. She didn't use words like outrageous or shameful. She let the facts do what facts do when they're laid out in sequence without embellishment. When she finished, the room was a different kind of quiet. "Victor Hale's administrative authority has been revoked," Hargrove said. "He is no longer employed by this hospital. A formal investigation into his conduct, including but not limited to the improper termination and the retaliatory complaint, is underway. The investigation's findings will be shared with the state licensing board, and given the involvement of a federal military asset, will also be submitted to the relevant federal oversight body. She paused. Marissa Cole has been placed on administrative leave pending a review by the Credentialing Committee and a separate review by the State Nursing Board. I will not predict the outcome of those reviews, that's not my place, but I want to be clear that the conduct the committee reviewed is documented and the documentation is complete. Another pause. Stella Carter is reinstated, effective today, with a designation to the trauma nursing rotation. Hargrove looked at her across the room, not at the space where she was sitting, at her. She will also serve as this hospital's first designated K-9 liaison for military and law enforcement working dogs, in partnership with Commander Brooks' unit. That role is a first for this institution. It exists because of what happened last night. And it exists because of the judgment one nurse used when she was 3 weeks into her first job and didn't have a single institutional reason to do anything other than stand back. The room moved. Not dramatically, but the kind of collective shift that happened in groups when something released, shoulders dropping slightly, breath coming differently. Dr. Osei said from his chair, "That's the right call, Dorothy." Hargrove looked at him. "I know it is." She looked back at the room. "I also want to say something that won't be in the official record, because official records have a way of flattening things that shouldn't be flat." She was quiet for a moment, choosing it. "We nearly killed a dog that saved a man's life, and we fired the person who understood that. And we did it because she was new and she didn't have enough seniority to make her voice count, and that should not have been possible in this hospital. It was. That's on all of us, not just the 2 people who are no longer here." She let that land. "We'll be doing a review of the escalation protocol for unusual incoming trauma situations. I'd like nursing staff input on that process, and I would particularly like input from people who are newer to this department, because last night was a specific lesson in what institutional habit looks like from the outside." She stepped back from the table. "That's what I wanted to say. Commander Brooks has a few words." Brooks moved to the front of the room without the particular ceremony that the setting seemed to call for. He stood where Hargrove had been and looked around the room once. "Ryan Mercer is out of recovery," he said. "He's going to walk out of this hospital. Titan is going to be cleared for active duty within the week. Our vet team came in this morning. He's in good shape." He paused. "My command is formally commending Stella Carter for her actions. That commendation will be in her professional record. It will also be in ours." Another pause, shorter. "That's all I have." He stepped back. Hargrove said, "Questions?" There were some. Procedural ones, mostly, about the K-9 liaison protocol, about the investigation timeline, about the trauma designation process. Stella answered the ones directed at her as briefly and accurately as she could. She was not comfortable being the front of the room. She was better at the wall. The meeting ended at 1:47. People filtered out in small groups, the way they did after department meetings, conversations picking up in the corridor that had been held during the formal part. Stella stayed in her chair for a moment. She was tired in a way that had passed through exhaustion and come out somewhere flatter on the other side. Dr. Farzan stopped beside her chair on his way out. "The tourniquet," he said. He was looking at a point above her head, the way surgeons sometimes talked, addressing the air rather than the person because they were more comfortable with precision than with eye contact. "Correctly applied, you said you were told. Standard field technique, 2 hours hold time, no tissue compromise." He paused. "I've been a trauma surgeon for 19 years. A correctly applied tourniquet in that scenario is the difference between a patient who makes it to the OR and one who doesn't." He looked at her then. "You asked the right question about who did it." He left before she could respond. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about Titan's vest, about the way working dogs were trained, about what 2 hours meant and what a dog could and couldn't do, and all the things she had set aside because she couldn't verify them. She decided to ask Ryan Mercer directly. Room 4. 1-2 was quieter than it had been that morning. The monitor cluster still beeped. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and made the room look warmer than hospital rooms usually did. Titan was there now. Nguyen had gotten clearance from the nursing staff on Ryan's floor, which had taken some negotiation, and Titan was on a mat in the corner that Nguyen had produced from somewhere, technically resting, actually tracking every person who came through the door. Ryan was more awake than that morning, more present. The fog had lifted enough that his eyes were sharp, even if the rest of him was still doing the slow work of recovering from blood loss and surgery and 2 hours on a mountain. Brooks was with him. He made a small movement when Stella came in, not leaving, just repositioning, and she understood she had maybe 10 minutes before Ryan needed to rest. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She thought about how to ask the thing she wanted to ask, and then decided the direct way was the right way. "Did Titan apply the tourniquet?" she said. Ryan looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his expression. Complicated. Not quite amusement, not quite grief. "He brought it to me," he said. His voice was still rough. "The kit was in the side pocket of my vest. I was in and out. I remember Titan. I remember him pawing at me, and then something hitting my hand, and I remember tightening it." He paused. "I don't know how much of that I actually did and how much I'm filling in, but the kit came out of the pocket, and I can't reach that pocket unconscious, so..." He left it there. Stella looked at Titan in the corner. He was watching Ryan with the steady attention she'd first seen in the ER doors. "He knew where it was," she said. "We train for it," Ryan said. "K9 units. They're not just attack dogs or trackers. They're trained for a lot of scenarios." He shifted slightly, managing something. "Titan's been with me through 3 deployments. He knows my kit better than some of the guys on my team." He said it without sentiment, as plain fact. "Farzan said the tourniquet is what got you to the OR." "Yeah." Ryan's jaw moved. "I know." She didn't push it further. Some things didn't need more words around them. She was about to stand when Ryan said, "They told me about your job, that you lost it for the night and then got it back. That's the short version. What's the long version?" She considered. "I lost it because I didn't have enough seniority for my judgment to count. I got it back because what I'd said turned out to be verifiable." She paused. "The outcome was right. The process was... it was what it was." Ryan looked at her steadily. "Does it bother you? That you needed us to show up for it to matter?" It was a sharper question than she'd expected, and she appreciated it for that. "Yes," she said. "A little." She thought about it more honestly. "What bothers me is that if you'd been a civilian, if Titan hadn't had federal designation, if Brooks's team hadn't come, the complaint against my license would still be pending. Victor would still have his job." She held that for a moment. "The thing I did was the same thing regardless of who the patient turned out to be. The value of it shouldn't have depended on his rank." Ryan was quiet. "No," he said. "It shouldn't have." He looked at the ceiling. "That's not a military problem or a hospital problem specifically. That's just how it is. People who don't have weight behind them have to be very right and be right loudly and hope someone with weight shows up." He paused. "You were right. You were as right as you could be. That matters even when the system doesn't catch it." She looked at him. "You've thought about this before." "I've seen it before." He didn't elaborate. She stood. She put her hand briefly on the bed rail. Not a dramatic gesture, just a physical acknowledgement of the space between them and what had happened in it. "I'm glad you're going to be okay." "Yeah." He looked at her. "Thank you for my dog." She nodded once. She looked at Titan. He looked back at her with those eyes that had first found hers across a crowded ER when she was crouching on the floor trying to make herself small and non-threatening. "He did most of it," she said. The HR office was on the first floor, near the administrative wing, in a room that smelled like toner and carpet. The HR director was a small woman named Patricia Feld, who had been with Riverside Crest for 14 years, and who processed Stella's reinstatement paperwork with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that the paperwork was not the point, but also that the paperwork had to be done. She handed Stella a temporary badge, the full employee version, no green orientation stripe, and a folder with the trauma unit transition details. Orientation for the trauma rotation starts Monday, Feld said. Dr. Osei has agreed to serve as your attending for the transition period. Stella looked up from the folder. Dr. Osei requested that? He did. Feld's expression was professionally neutral. 7:30 a.m., Trauma Bay. You'll want to review the unit's triage protocol before then. It's in the folder. Stella took the badge. It was a small thing, a plastic card with her photo and her name and the hospital's logo. She had held one before, briefly, before Victor had taken it. This one felt different in her hand, not heavier, just earned in a way the first one hadn't quite been. The first one had been given. This one had been taken away and returned, and the returning had a different weight to it. She clipped it on. She found Brooks in the main lobby at 3:15 with two of his team preparing to leave. Reyes had the vehicle keys, Nguyen had Titan on the lead. The lobby felt different in the afternoon than it had at midnight. Ordinary almost, people in chairs with phones, a child running between the seats while a parent called after her. "We're heading out," Brooks said. "Okay." She looked at Titan. He was pressed against Nguyen's leg, watching the lobby with the professional attention that apparently never fully switched off. "When does he go back?" "Our vet clears him Monday. If he's solid, he's back with the unit Wednesday." Brooks paused. "Ryan's transfer to the Naval Medical Facility is Thursday. Recovery there, then evaluation. Timeline for return to duty is, we'll see." "Months, Stella said. "Probably." She nodded. She thought about what Ryan had said, that the value of what she'd done shouldn't have depended on his rank, and the honest acknowledgement that it had, and the way he'd held both of those things at once without trying to make one of them go away. That was the thing about people who'd been through difficult things. They were often less interested in comfortable versions of the truth than people who hadn't. "The liaison certification," she said. "The 4-hour course." "We'll schedule it in the next 2 weeks," Brooks said. "One of our K9 handlers will run it here. We'll bring in 2 dogs so you're working with animals you haven't handled before." He looked at her. "It's not complicated. You already know most of it." "I know the instinct part," she said. "I don't know the protocol part." "That's what the 4 hours is for." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who used it as punctuation rather than performance. "You did good work last night, in conditions that were specifically designed to make good work impossible." She didn't have a ready answer for that. She said, "Take care of him." And she meant Ryan, and she meant Titan, and Brooks understood both. Titan looked at her when they moved toward the exit. He held her gaze for a moment with those specific eyes, and then he looked forward, and Nguyen pushed the door open, and they went out into the afternoon, and the lobby door closed behind them with the soft, pressurized sound of all hospital doors. Stella stood in the lobby. She clipped her badge straight. "Okay." The next several days were not a clean resolution. She would remember that later when she tried to think about how the story went, that the days after were not triumphant exactly, just different. She was tired for most of a week. She went home the evening of the staff meeting and slept for 11 hours and woke up at 6 a.m. with the particular disorientation of someone who had processed a large amount in a short time and whose body had simply stopped accepting more. She ate cereal and looked at the folder Patricia Feld had given her and read the trauma unit triage protocol and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something that was not quite excitement but was pointed in that direction. The formal news about Victor and Marissa came in pieces, as these things always did. The state nursing board launched its own investigation into the retaliatory complaint within 48 hours, which was faster than Okafor had predicted. Gerald Whitmore called Stella to let her know it was underway. He did not tell her what the outcome would be, and she didn't ask, because she understood that asking was not the same as knowing and that waiting was the only available option. The federal inquiry, Brooks Command's formal report, was filed on Thursday. Stella knew this because Okafor told her, and because a copy of the sections relevant to her conduct arrived in her email with a note from Okafor that said simply, "Read page 7 specifically." She read it. Page 7 described her actions in the specific flat language of a federal report, which somehow made it more real than any of the other versions she'd heard. The official language stripped away the drama and left just the sequence of what had happened. In order, sourced and documented, permanent. Victor Hale's name appeared on pages 4, 5, 6, and 9. The hospital's investigation concluded in 3 weeks. Its findings were shared with the state licensing board as Hargrove had said they would be. Victor's administrative license was suspended pending review, which meant he couldn't hold an administrator position in a Colorado healthcare facility while the review was ongoing. His attorney issued a statement that described the situation as a misunderstanding, which was the kind of statement attorneys issued when there was nothing more useful to say. Marissa Cole's credentialing review concluded in the same 3-week window. The committee's finding was a formal censure, a documented mark in her professional record, and a requirement to complete a 60-hour ethics and judgment refresher course before returning to any senior nursing position. It was not a license revocation. Some people thought it should have been. Some people thought the censure was proportionate given that she'd been following an administrator's directive. Stella heard both positions in the break room and in passing conversations, and chose not to offer hers because her position was complicated in ways she wasn't ready to make public, and because the committee had done its job and the outcome was what it was. Marissa never came back to Riverside Crest. She submitted her resignation before the review concluded, which meant the censure followed her into whatever came next rather than remaining attached to this specific job. That was her choice to make. Dr. Osei was her supervising attending for the trauma transition. He was exacting and specific and almost never complimented her directly, but in the 3rd week he stopped after reviewing her triage assessment on a multi-system trauma case and said, "That's a good call," and walked on, and she understood that this was the equivalent, from him, of a standing ovation. She was not perfect in those 6 weeks. She was wrong about a medication interaction on day 8 and caught it herself at the last moment, which left her hand shaking for an hour afterward. She froze once, briefly, on a case that moved faster than she'd seen before and had to consciously walk herself back into motion. She asked questions that more experienced nurses probably thought were basic, and she asked them anyway because not asking was not an option she was willing to use. She was learning. That was the point. The liaison certification happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the night with the doors. The K-9 handler was a petty officer named Garza, who was patient and detailed and who brought 2 dogs she hadn't met, a German Shepherd named Axis and a Malinois, younger than Titan, named Breck. And the 4 hours in the hospital's rear training space covered identification markers, approach protocols, communication signals, and the specific set of behaviors that distinguished a working dog in distress from a working dog doing its job. Garza told her twice, in different ways, that she already understood the behavioral language, that the training was mostly vocabulary around what she could already read. At the end of the 4 hours, he gave her a certification card and a document for her personnel file and said, "First time we've done this for a civilian hospital." He said it not as a compliment exactly, but as a marker. This is a new thing, and you are the person it started with. She drove home with the card in her bag and the window down, even though it was cold, because she needed the air, and she thought about the last few weeks in the specific non-linear way she thought about things when she was alone in a car. Not sequentially, but all at once, the pieces present simultaneously rather than in order. She thought about her uncle's kennels in Idaho and what she'd learned there, which she'd never thought of as professional development. She thought about nursing school and the triage course where the instructor had said that the first skill in emergency nursing was not medical knowledge but situational reading, knowing what you were actually looking at before you decided what to do about it. She thought about the ER doors opening in Titan's orbit and the specific moment of crouching on the floor and feeling the room hold its breath. She thought about the parking lot in the rain, the badge in Victor's hand, the feeling of standing in the cold with nowhere to go, no badge, no status, just the certainty that what she'd done had been the right thing, and the knowledge that the right thing and the recognized thing were not always the same thing, and sometimes were not even close. That gap between right and recognized was the thing she'd carry forward, not bitterly, but honestly. Because the honest version of what had happened was that she'd needed Brooks's team to arrive for the truth to have weight. And the honest version was also that she'd acted before knowing that help was coming. And both of those things were true simultaneously and they didn't cancel each other out. You couldn't control whether help arrived. You could control whether you stayed standing until it did. Ted. Ryan Mercer called her on a Wednesday, 5 weeks after the surgery. He was at the Naval Medical Facility, 4 hours south, somewhere in his recovery that he described as walking with a cane and complaining about physical therapy, which sounded to her like someone who was recovering on schedule and not enjoying it. He asked how the trauma rotation was going. She told him about the medication interaction, about the freeze, about Dr. Osei's particular style of compliment. He listened like he had in room 412, actually listening, not waiting. Titan made it back Wednesday, he said. Brooks told me. He passed his evaluation. They cleared him full duty. A pause. He found my socks the other day when the handler put them across the room. Operational capacity fully intact. She laughed. It surprised her. Genuine. Involuntary. The kind that came from the release of something held tight for a long time. Good, she said. Tell him I said so. I'll pass it along. A pause. I'm going to come up to Denver in a few months, when I'm off the cane. I'd like to bring Titan to the hospital, officially as the first K9 visitor under the new protocol, if that works with your liaison role. She thought about Titan's nails on the linoleum and the way he'd sat on her feet in the corridor and looked up at her with that absolute certainty. That works, she said. The day the trauma transition officially ended, 6 weeks to the day from her reinstatement, Dr. Osei signed her transition form in the break room while she was refilling her coffee and handed it to her without ceremony. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. You filed the request to supervise me, she said. He picked up his own coffee. Yes. Why? He considered the question with the deliberateness he brought to most things. Because what you did that night required a specific kind of perception that is difficult to teach. I wanted to know if the rest of the skill set was buildable around it. He paused. It is. He walked out. She stood in the break room with the signed form in her hand and the coffee going warm in her cup, and the corridor outside running at its ordinary pace, nurses and orderlies and the cart that always beeped going around the corner by the supply room, and she let herself have the moment, fully, without qualification. She had walked into a hospital 3 weeks into her first job and stood in front of something that the entire room had decided was a threat, and she had seen it differently, and she had been wrong about nothing except the cost. The cost had been real. The parking lot, and the rain, and the badge, and the complaint that had come in at 2 a.m. while she was waiting to find out if a stranger was going to live, those had been real, and they had happened, and no commendation removed them from the record of what she'd experienced. But she was here. She had the form in her hand and the badge on her chest, and a role that hadn't existed before she'd created the need for it. And she would go out to that corridor and work a shift that would probably include something she hadn't seen before, and something she'd have to ask about, and something she'd get wrong and have to correct. That was the job. That was what it actually was, without the clean version layered over it. She thought about a dog sitting on her feet with complete conviction about where he was supposed to be. She thought about the thing you couldn't take from someone who was willing to stand in front of a catch pole for something they knew was right. Not seniority, not rank, not the institutional weight that made voices count in rooms where they otherwise wouldn't. The thing underneath all of that. The willingness to see clearly and say what you saw and stay standing in the parking lot in the rain until the world caught up. She tucked the form under her arm. She walked back out to the floor.